Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to bonus content. Our guest today is Blumi. We talk about the ceasefire in Yemen, the circumstances and the reasons why it happened. We also talk about energy development, the Hodeidah blockade, the situation in Aden, the ousting of Hadi, and the creation of a new presidential council. And we continue our discussion from previous episodes about the war within wars in Yemen and the Gulf states. In a bonus segment, we talk about Sweden and Finland changing their neutral status and joining NATO. When we recorded this, Turkey was still holding up that approval, but yesterday at the NATO summit, that block was cleared, and it was announced that they would be joining NATO. Dr. Blumi is an historian, an author, professor of global history, Islamic World, Ottoman Empire, Yemen, and Albania. His most recent book, Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, tells the story of the wars in Yemen, but also, quote, ultimately tells an even larger story of today's political economy of global capitalism, development, and the war on terror as disparate actors intersect in Arabia, unquote. He also authored the book Ottoman Refugees, 1878 to 1939, Migration in a Post-Imperial World. We recorded this on June 10th, 2022. Blumi is here, and it is great to see you again, Isa, especially he's in Beirut, so the different problems with power and internet, we are very lucky to be able to have a connection and a video connection, and it's always great to see you, Isa. Thanks so much for coming back.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Joanne. It's wonderful to see you again.
So we are going to talk hopefully about a number of different subjects today, maybe not as long on each topic, but to cover a lot of things, because I'd really like to get your insights on things, Isa. I don't think there's anybody I know who has a bigger picture than you do, and on a number of different things. But as I mentioned, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about Yemen and Saudi Arabia. I'm very happy that there is some relief in Yemen. I don't really understand why it happened, and therefore I'm not as, I'm still unsettled about it. I'm afraid it won't last. And I'd also like to touch on some other issues, like, let me just get my list here. I guess dig in a little bit more on Saudi Arabia and what's going on with this realignment, this battle with the Biden administration, and the whole issue with energy and oil. I don't know, there's so many things I want to touch on, but if I could, I would also like to move over to the EU, NATO, Sweden. Since you're originally from Sweden, I'm very curious to get your take on what might be happening there, and on the whole Ukraine situation too. Turkey and Russia, there's so many things, so many complicated relationships and situations going on. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on some of those, but I think we should probably start with Yemen, right? I had not been keeping up with Yemen as much as I normally do. I know that there's been a truce of sorts, a ceasefire, which is great. I'm not exactly sure why it happened and why it's holding now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it is now a very convenient narrative that's coming from the usual suspects to now deflate the gathering momentum of hostility to the war itself and to the actors who helped create this coalition in the first place. I think the expose of violence that had been registering more and more, people more and more became conscious of what was going on. I think that was in many ways by design. The arrival of the Biden administration, we have to remember, meant the return of some of the key engineers of the coalition in 2015 in the Obama administration. And what that basically promised was a rehabilitation of Qatar, which indeed did occur, and it was a very public statement, and the embrace of Qatar as the primary ally again in the Gulf for the United States under the Biden administration. That signaled already late last year a revival of certain sectors within the war within the war, what I have called it. Within this so-called coalition, there are actual rivalries, very deep, these seated hostilities between the United Arab Emirates and especially Qatar, but also Saudi Arabia. And the other underlying conditions that led these countries to pursue a campaign on a vulnerable Yemen that had basically a window opened with this events of 2014, early 2015, the removal of Hadi as the interim president by this large coalition led by Ansar Allah, something that we've discussed about in the past, did again offer the Obama administration the opportunity to wedge especially Qatari interests deep into a potential for solidifying the regime change dynamics that took place throughout the Middle East in the Arab Spring era, which was transforming. There was an ongoing war in Syria. There was instability in Libya. They couldn't find a long-term solution with warring parties dividing up that country. And it seemed that this was part of the package or the recognition that Yemen would be parceled out amongst these coalition partners. It turned out to be an unviable coalition, however, because of the still very narrow geography of where the primary assets that would have, in many ways, resolved some of the short-term concerns that Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar had in their own domestic political economy concerns. We're talking about a period that lasts until today, but especially in 2019, with which we are now recognizing as not only a country by country or regional, but a global reset, quite literally, an economic structural transformation that has been ongoing, largely disguised by, at least in the West, by a corona virus that has been identified as a threat to global public health, which had successfully for the last couple of years diverted people's attentions to what in the meantime was fundamentally changing in how the world economy was managed. And certainly this is something that all the big players in the Gulf, who had very expensive advisors advising each of the ruling families, themselves very fragile and vulnerable to domestic violence. There were uprisings happening throughout the 2010s and 2020s in Saudi Arabia itself. And Qatar had also faced hostility from a UAE that had grown increasingly valuable for the Trump administration as they had long been partners. And so the arrival of Trump changed dramatically the kind of relations the United States would have with this coalition in Yemen. And since the war continued, there was the assumption that the war would end very quickly, that there would be capitulation, that there would be at least a sequestering off of the larger areas populated by Yemenis into an impoverished zone where the lion's share of the resources would be divided up amongst these countries and the companies that were doing business with them. OMV, a big Austrian offshore oil company, has remained a primary beneficiary even during the course of this war. And their partnership initially with Qatar, facilitated by the Clintons and the Obama administration. In early this year, and this is where we're getting to what is happening and why this ceasefire was perhaps necessary. Early this year became increasingly an open question about the viability of their continued exploitation of gas and oil resources that was coming mostly from a region called Shabwa, which is, there's an area to the further north called Marib, which is a much larger geographic space, but where huge percentage of Yemen's known oil and gas, and that is already being exploited, is in operation. But in Shabwa, there's also significant amounts that are actually geographically much closer and by way of infrastructure, still connected to the port of Mukalla. And these areas were divided up between rival factions who were working on behalf of Qatar and UAE, respectively. And it was a very, very difficult, from 2015 to basically the beginning of 2022, there was a series of back and forth territorial conquest between these rival factions. And in the meantime, this infighting left large numbers of Yemenis on the sidelines. Many had been effectively corrupted or coerced, paid off to remain on the sidelines. They were not going to join either the Qatari or the Saudi or the Emirati-backed militias that were on the ground, most of which were run by foreign mercenaries anyways. There are huge numbers of Sudanese soldiers from Chad, from Colombia, and other countries, and with a lot of European, American trained mercenaries serving as field officers for these various militias. But the UAE started to see a combination of factors come into play. They were a big component to these thrusts to gain control over the far southwest part of Yemen in 2019, 2020. So they were threatening the port of Hodeidah to the extent where they recaptured the port of Mocha, and then we're moving northwards. And there was a major battle that it became increasingly clear to Ansar Allah that the UAE had formed a very important alliance with a set of mercenary units that were, they become known as the giants in the terminology used in the media. And they were celebrated as Emirati strike forces that were working with one of the relatives of Ali Abdullah Saleh, Tariq Saleh, and were able to secure this area and threaten Hodeidah, which was really the only port of access for the lion's share of Yemen's population who are living under Ansar Allah's administration. And if the capture of Hodeidah would have taken place, you would have had massive starvation for sure, but probably also a rapid demise of the resistance to this coalition. But they could not win. And this is crucial. And it ultimately led to an agreement signed in Stockholm where there would be more or less a settlement, if you will, a kind of ceasefire in that region. It's an area called Tihama. If you want to look it up, topographically, it's a very flat area that comes from the Red Sea, and then some 20 kilometers inland, then the mountains start to happen. And that's where Ansar Allah is able to protect its population. But they have protected that city of Hodeidah on the coast, and therefore it as the main artery or main access point for any kind of assistance in terms of food or fuel, which is highly important for the people, the 20+ million people living under siege. This was one way of leveraging future subsequent discussions, if you will. And this would be something used by the UAE very effectively in terms of this territory in Shabwa, which was oil and gas rich, again, primarily under the thumb or the interests served are this OMV company from Austria and Hunt Oil, and a little bit of Total, French Total, but Hunt Oil out of Oklahoma has old links to the Bush family back from the 1980s already. This is the first real oil company that made
Yeah.
overtures to Ali Abdullah Saleh in the 1980s. So this is a long history. It's very interesting, and it needs more research about what's actually happening in 2021, early 2022. But shortly, what's happening, to keep it short, Ansar Allah and its allies are making headway in the main lines of defense around Marib. They are able to capture large tracts of territory and basically are looking down into the city of Marib. And at some point in time, there was probably a quiet agreement that they would not actually try to take the city, which would have completely transformed the war. What they also were doing was successfully taking large tracts of the Shabwa area, including conquering some of the oil and gas fields of this province. And that's immediately unleashed a series of campaigns to try to reverse this process.
So Ansar Allah was taking parts of Shabwa?
Yes.
Oh, progress there too. Okay.
Yes. So they were now entering into an area that had long been under the Muslim Brotherhood's Islah party, which is the primary asset of Qatar. But because of the politics that this war really, there's a lot of politics involved, a lot of actors, again, who remained largely off, have not participated in the war. More and more started to join Ansar Allah. There were actually very large and very photogenic meetings of these leaders taking their entourage, hundreds and hundreds of jeeps, going in over the mountains into Sana'a and making meetings with Ansar Allah and saying, we are now declaring our allegiance to the Yemeni people, to the struggle against these people. And the primary victim of this was the governor of Shabwa, who was, again, this Qatari asset, who was able to sequester themselves away from the key areas that Saudi or Emirati forces were struggling for in the rest of the areas that Ansar Allah was not controlling. So around Aden, for instance, which is now, according to coalition, the de facto capital of Yemen, because that's supposedly where the president's offices and the ministries are based. There's no one is there. Everyone is either in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. There is no functioning state, and I'll get to that if we have a chance after I kind of mention what's going on here. But so what happened is that the UAE is basically forced to enter into the fray in Shabwa. And they did by sending these mercenaries who are, again, called the giants. They wear on their uniforms Emirati flags. But if you just look at their bodies, the fact that they have gloves over their hands and masks over their faces.
They're Americans or Europeans.
They're clearly Australian or Euro-American soldiers. And they were able to turn back a bit the successes that were eliminating the factions who were being supported by Qatar and the Islah party. And this broke down then the relationship that the quiet one that had been established in Stockholm 2 years earlier regarding the West Coast. And this basically led to then the unleashing of a series of attacks on UAE territory with missiles and drone attacks. I don't know if you remember,
I do.
In February, that suddenly got the news around the world. Attacks coming from Yemen, hitting Abu Dhabi assets, and a new wave hitting key assets of Saudi Arabia. So there was kind of a new generation, if you will, of these ballistic missile attacks, all of which were engineered and built in North Yemen, which is quite remarkable in its own right, considering the conditions that these soldiers are having to work in. But they have continuously built and improved their ability to bring some kind of ordnance deep into Saudi and UAE territory. And so this period in February of this year really marked a turn that ultimately led to the Biden administration very publicly taking a new kind of position. And you begin to start seeing mainstream media actually reporting on the war. And this was, to me, an alert that just like with northern Syria, that Yemen would be again the area of focus for United States State Department, but more importantly, military. There's going to be a greater attempt to justify the presence, which was largely secret until that stage, to actually advance and expand American direct intervention. And we did see that with larger numbers of ships off the coast of Western Yemen, as well as larger numbers of actual troops on the ground protecting certain assets, in whether it be the oil gas fields or in respecting the government that the administration and the Western world has recognized as legitimate. But in the meantime, behind closed doors, a lot of other things are happening, to the extent that, as we saw in April, after the continued attacks, after warning again and again that if you do not stop it, we do not change the dynamics of this war, if you keep trying to put us under siege, denying our people energy, denying our people food and medicines, keep bombing us, then we're going to pursue our campaign against Madrid. We're going to recapture territories along the border with Saudi Arabia. Sorry, there's a kitty coming out. Okay. But more importantly, we're going to start firing these ballistic missiles again. And Saudi Arabia saw a series of very, very devastating attacks, both in Jeddah area and in the areas of the southwest of Saudi Arabia, but even as far as Dhahran and close to Riyadh. So desalination plants, lots of refineries. One of the biggest refineries that Aramco owns in Jeddah was destroyed. One that was literally north of what was at that stage the training week of the Formula One race.
Oh wait, another refinery? I was thinking of the big attack, but on the other side.
Yeah. So
in Jeddah, okay.
In Jeddah as well. And that really began that in late March, early April. This phase of okay, we're going to actually get serious about stopping this, because this is getting out of control. And I think it was getting out of control politically inside, let's say, the Yemen that the Qataris, the Emiratis, and the Saudis were struggling over, and as much as with Ansar Allah itself. And Ansar Allah was responding by this failure and probably taking advantage of the political griping and the fact that the Biden administration had clearly repositioned itself towards propping up Qatari interest, which had all kinds of consequences, not only at the war itself, but on the economic capacities of especially UAE and Saudi Arabia to, for instance, borrow money. You saw a new kind of wave of trying to market themselves as being indeed free of what everybody knew were some systematic, fundamental, structural problems with these countries' economies. And when these refineries were hit, the capacity of the KSA of Saudi Arabia to actually do things like become market makers, to actually flood the market with oil or to stabilize prices became impossible. Something that is not discussed except in the behind closed doors in the oil industry, but this has already been a problem for Saudi Arabia for years. They just cannot produce enough oil. They literally buy, for instance, Iraqi oil off in the market to resell as Saudi oil in order to remain that player and adding 2 million barrels a day, for instance. But the very fact that they cannot produce because pipeline infrastructure is being damaged, because these refineries are put out of commission for 6 months, very expensive to repair. The insurers and those who are providing credit to Saudi Arabia were beginning to actually undermine this stability of the Mohammed bin Salman government. And we saw this manifested in even domestic outbreaks of very vocal hostility to the government. And this led basically to this demand, again, ushered in diplomatically through diplomatic speak, with the UN representative in the middle of this, saying we're negotiating for a 2 months truce. In the meantime, they get rid of Hadi, the very personality that this coalition supposedly was created to reinstate into power. They literally remove him from power. And they put up and established what they call a presidential leadership council with all these old cronies from Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime. One guy in particular, Rashad Al-Alami, who's the former Minister of Interior under Ali Abdullah Saleh. Can you imagine this, the blood on this man's hands? And what kind of image this projects to Yemenis, that this guy, who was Ali Abdullah Saleh, the guy who was overthrown in 2011 through street protests, and was despised by large segments of Yemeni population until today, is now his henchman, is the guy who was literally perpetuating state murder on large numbers of opponents of the regime, is now at the head of this council. There's something wrong here. But it was, again, no one really wanted to take the extra step of actually questioning what's the rationale behind this. No one has heard from Hadi and some of his tighter circle ever since. Many people speculate he's been either murdered or he's in jail somewhere. You will not see him again. But it did then usher in this ceasefire, which for 2 months has been a ceasefire that has constantly been broken, or let's say the conditions or what was agreed upon, no use of weapons, no use of drone overflights, and the gathering of intelligence, were all regularly broken. Ansar Allah always produces every day a list. Sometimes they go to the extent of 150, 170 examples of violations of the ceasefire. And this goes on every day. More importantly, with the United States at the head, they keep blocking the ships that are supposedly bringing emergency supplies of food and of oil to the people through Hodeidah. So the last 2 months, they've just recently renewed the ceasefire, which is, yes, on paper a ceasefire, but there's still quite a bit of violence. There's only been 2 or 3 fuel ships actually allowed to come to, which is just a drop in a well, right? There's very little fuel is actually arriving and making life quite miserable for people in northern Yemen. So the siege of the entirety of northern Yemen remains. And there are occasional drone attacks, there are sniper attacks, there are attempted assassinations of key figures, both in Sana'a and then in some of the other governorates that are actually still administered by Ansar Allah's people. So there's a sense that there is an attempt to use this as cover to rebuild and maybe resolve some of the political problems that have been emerging for all 3 actors in this so-called coalition. It's not doing very well, because if you look at the news coming largely from the south part of Yemen, where the coalition forces are based, and their 3 rival factions who are supposedly claiming certain aspects of legitimacy, they're killing each other off. Aden is, as a result, facing big problems with electricity. They have a huge fire in its refinery yesterday. So they're facing some of the same problems that people, ironically enough, in northern Yemen are experiencing. But they are supposedly living under the conditions of a coalition-led government. So there's a lot of violence, especially in the south right now, as these 3 different factions are fighting out amongst themselves. And this has not been reported. And
even more, Aden's had problems for quite a while now, even worse than it was before.
Well, that's hard to tell, but it is remarkable that you can see reports from certain sources saying this person was killed, this person just lost his chin as they tried to assassinate him with motorcycle hitmen driving by, or there was a mortar attack on the base of one of these militias that's supported by the UAE, et cetera, et cetera. And in the meantime, the whole issue about Shabwa has just the last couple of days again been brought to the fore with fighting, as Islam, which lost the ability to govern this key area and therefore lost its relationship to these 2 main oil companies, who said, well, whoever is going to protect our assets and allow us to take 30, 40,000 barrels of oil a day out of this region are going to be the ones that we support via Washington and Brussels. And it just so happens that the Emiratis have taken over violently through this so-called giant special forces unit, the position of governing the Shabwa. But that doesn't mean that Qatar has, nor the United States faction that supports Qatar are capitulated. So, and you see it manifested in other parts of South Yemen. So it's a mess. This coalition is a mess. It's been from day one. This ceasefire is, again, a way to provide some kind of cover for the repositioning of various actors. My concern is that this is also going to always be used as leverage against Ansar Allah. They really are trying to not strike back at these provocations, because I think this would be a really wonderful opportunity for the Biden administration to then say, all hell's broken loose, we need to intervene directly, which is something that I think Ansar Allah people are very aware of. And they've put themselves somewhat in the corner.
I see.
And this was, for me, I mean, no one wants to see war continue, of course, but there was some momentum lost. There was clear vulnerability that was exposed, and there are ways to exploit the failures of this coalition. And by now, it's actually going to be taken. It's going to take the form of settling scores in the south, with perhaps a new arrangement emerging. The very fact that this Presidential Leadership Council, supposedly orchestrated from Riyadh, is something that Riyadh is mastering. It does not necessarily mean that when Biden goes and visits Saudi Arabia over the last couple of days, that Saudi Arabia is actually in the seat of in the position to actually make things happen on the ground, either in Yemen or in the region itself. They've been very vocal and very invested in trying to play the role on behalf of the United States to influence, for instance, the Lebanese elections, which just took place. And that proved to be somewhat of a failure. They really could not prop up the kind of politicians through gaining seats in parliament to upset and make impossible for the continuation of Hezbollah as a viable political party in Lebanon. So therefore, you have new kinds of iterations of Saudi attempt to play by rules that is understood that are necessary in order for the savior for the regime to remain in power. In the meantime, there continues to decapitate Shia leaders, spiritual leaders, political opponents. There have been some very public executions taking place, even at the point during the Formula One race, which again, it's quite remarkable that Formula One becoming such a global phenomenon where you can watch it on Netflix, and people all over the world are fascinated with this kind of story of race cars going or driving through these cities, and they're going to places like Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, and Jeddah, which is waging war on a country like Yemen. And if I just made this whole event right before the ceasefire took place with this Formula One, it was quite interesting. In fact, many of the drivers who, of course, this is huge money. These companies and the investors in these race cars put a lot of money in. They made big deals with Mohammed bin Salman's regime to bring Formula One to Jeddah. When these missiles hit north of the race course, and you can actually see the fumes of smoke coming from the refinery, a lot of the racers said, "I want to leave. We're leaving."
Yeah, I would think so.
And basically, it's, as I understand it, Mohammed bin Salman basically said, "No, you're not going to leave. Your planes are not going to come to pick up your cars. And if you do not race," he literally had them kidnapped. Now, we'll see what happens next year if they ever go back. But this was what many drivers were not so secretly, not so quietly saying, that we can't leave, actually. We don't want to be here. And we're basically told we have to do the race, which is very interesting.
It's surreal is what it is. It's just...
It is surreal, but I mean, if you think about how the world operates these days, we're forced and coerced to do a lot of things that, we're forced to perform as if nothing is going on behind closed doors. But this will be interesting with the World Cup coming to Qatar. And, there's a lot of controversy about that. And UAE and Saudi Arabia have been vying and lobbying for a long time and say, well, Qatar is a supporter of these terrorist groups, and it's unstable, and they've been putting out, which you could more or less figure out which mainstream media outposts are getting the money from the UAE or getting money from Saudi Arabia or from Qatar, because they report very different stories about who is the evil actor regarding exploiting labor, regarding women's rights, but also the war in Yemen. So you can actually see a very distinctive narrative about how evil the Emirates are in respect to Yemen in Washington Post and New York Times, and that's largely because of the alliances the editors have with Qatar. And similarly with Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia, right? It's quite vocal about how evil that administration is, right? And in the meantime, you hear nothing about Qatar. So that, which is a very interesting way of monitoring events in the Middle East, is to understand that there are very explicit silences as much as advocacy for certain regimes or certain campaigns. Everyone has highlighted how Ukraine has received so much attention, and some people have been outraged by the fact that the European and American leaders have actually literally said this, that while there are refugees around the world, Ukrainians are like us, so we have to actually care more about what happens to them. And so this is quite similar with respect to wars like we have in Ethiopia, which no one talks about.
Hardly anybody, you're right.
The return of American troops to Somalia, Mogadishu, Somalia, which no one has talked about, and there's a lot of interesting things about what's going on there. And of course, this war in Yemen. But this was a long answer, Joanne. My apologies. But
no, I want to hear more. So, in between there are a couple things I'd like to pull a thread on, but I hesitate to do that because I want to get as much of those long answers as many of those as I can. I appreciate them. I just don't get there's hardly anybody who provides this perspective. It's very cut and dry. And then there are sort of areas where nobody has any idea. Like, Aden is just such a confusing place to understand what's even happening there. But anyway, I did suspect that the ceasefire might have something to do with those two oil development provinces. And, as it turns out, the timing of this is when the oil prices are through the roof too. So,
what that means, of course, is that new projects can suddenly be feasible, because of course this takes lots of financing. The pipelines that were in theory to go through Syria, for instance, over the last 10, 15 years, in many ways the geography of the war is influenced by the projected route of pipelines that would go from the east coast of Arabia through whatever happens to Syria, Iraq, to Turkey, and then to European markets. There has been long measures to try to find alternatives to Russian gas and oil, and bring some more kind of opportunities for those who make a hell of a lot of money building this kind of infrastructure. And this costs tens of billions of dollars. You need the financing for it. And in order for it to be viable, you need prices at a certain high rate. And so now Qatari the gas field that they're sharing with Iran is actually something that's viable and necessary. This allows for new kinds of infrastructure investments, which will be very lucrative for those who have a lot of influence on decisions being made in Washington and Brussels, let alone Tehran or Tel Aviv. Right now, we have a dispute over territory off the coast of Lebanon here. A Greek company under the auspices of Israeli claims to this territory are now about to start tapping into a very large gas field. And Lebanese nationalists are up in arms about this because this is disputed territory. A lot of fields off of the coast of Gaza are now open for exploration, even though these are infringements on international law. And more importantly, going back to Yemen and Somalia, there are going to be new fields that are, again, they don't quite know where these fields are. For a long time, Yemen remained off the chart, if you will, for development because it was deemed to be too expensive. The politics that required a lot of money to actually pay off certain actors to maintain the kind of exploration teams and then to actually build an infrastructure if you did find large amounts of gas required some kind of political compliance. And Yemen, for bless their hearts, Yemenis have been very hard to corrupt, consistently at least. But the conditions are right and the money is right now with prices going up, that people who invested or have the capacity to very quickly develop field offshore, especially offshore oil and gas, which Yemen and Somalia, the Horn of Africa have, there's going to be a hell of a lot of money made just in building the infrastructure, let alone drawing out the actual product and then processing it and then selling it to markets. And the Chinese are big players in this. And it's very interesting that just before the ceasefire took place, there was another vote with the Security Council, in with both Russia and China agreed in calling Ansar Allah a terrorist group, and took the side again of the so-called coalition, the aggressors in this war to destroy a country, and which should have alerted anyone who still has these fantasies that we have a bipolar world in which, we have the Chinese and the Russians on one side, sometimes heralded as the saviors, if
The
you will.
saviors, right.
And then you have a rival empire on the other, where in fact there's so much collaboration and cooperation in so many other fields that
Or
one
similar goals and similar tactics. Yeah.
similar goals and tactics that one has to wonder what's going on in Ukraine with a different set of eyes or glasses, interpretive glasses, because even there's a lot of weird synergies of interest which go back already since the 1990s, when the Soviet Union was parceled out very cheaply to not only oligarchs who are now very much powerful people in London and Paris and in Washington, but many of these other big-time players in energy, especially, with the Biden family being very invested in pipelines, by the way, as well as Pelosi and the usual suspects from Victoria Nuland and others, who are instigating trouble in Eurasia for a decade already, since the 2010s. But that's something a little bit further afield, perhaps, than you wanted to go. I don't know. But,
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm dying to get into that subject too, because, but yeah, I won't do that yet. Yeah, I mean, how can that not be a factor? And thank you for that little segue, which I think is really important, really important. If we can, though, I think I sent you a story about, first of all, Washington Post, along with Columbia, they issued this report about the U.S. complicity in airstrikes, and I'm thinking, Washington Post is reporting this? You just, yeah, something's up with that. And the other story that I thought was pretty interesting was a story about Biden's upcoming visit to Saudi Arabia and what MBS may be trying to achieve, and offering, all right, well, I don't want to dig into it too much, but none of these things passed muster with me. I mean, just the fact that the Washington Post is now a good guy reporting and calling out U.S. complicity in Yemen, really? So I'm trying to think what's the best way to approach this. Did you see that report? Did you have any thoughts on that report that came out, or is it significant?
I think we have to dismiss these gestures that are one, they will appear for 1 or 2 days and then fade off into everyone will forget about them. So there's really not going to be any kind of serious impact. It may be a justification to get rid of one or two officials at various bottlenecks of power in the military-industrial complex in the context of the Pentagon politics that goes on. I don't know if there was anyone really personally blamed other than kind of a larger infrastructure that's it again may provide an added piece of element, a bullet point or two on the portfolio of these meetings that come up, but which of course are the meetings themselves, the physical presence of Biden or Trump before them. There's a lot of conversations that go on beforehand, and especially with a client like Saudi Arabia, the marketing of Saudi Arabia actually going rogue and somehow moving independently of and separating itself from the United States is, for me, a joke. And I think Trump was his beguiling honesty, his gangster kind of discourse that was shared publicly was a very good example of how American politics works in this region. I don't know if your audience remembers this speech he gave in front of an adoring audience where he says he recollected his conversation with the king of Saudi Arabia. He says, "Hey, king," he says, "you know that without us, you wouldn't survive 2 weeks. So you better, basically start paying for these weapons that we're going to keep sending you." And of course, the support, the tactical support, and the upkeep of this equipment that comes with this, but you're going to have to pay in cash. And of course, the people clap in the audience. But this is really how things are working. And he just makes it into somewhat of a show, but it is in fact the nature of the relationship. And what's interesting is that Trump did change to an extent the kind of relationship that the region had with itself by cultivating strong relations with certain companies that made the grab for exclusive access to these markets for their weapons. It did shut out Swedish companies and German companies and Canadian companies that were actually selling a lot more weapons to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar during this war in Yemen. So that is probably changing again. So, since Mohammed bin Salman is in dire straits and trying to find ways to sustain his regime itself through all kinds of lots of circus for the populace who are increasingly finding their living standards dropping. They're increasingly realizing that they're going to pay a hell of a lot more for the things that they have been more or less coached to constantly covet and consume in their day-to-day lives, from the junk food that's produced in factories, both in Saudi Arabia and abroad. Gas prices for their fuel, for their cars are rocketing 80% since February. So in many things that are affecting the Western economies in the United States or in Europe are affecting also these countries that are heavily dependent on imports. They're stuck with an association with especially Atlantic economies that make them quite vulnerable to these inflation that we're observing in our own parts of the world. And because there was austerity imposed on the population already years ago, a VAT was charged, initiated 10% of value-added tax on all products. The move towards forcing Saudis to actually go work in service economy, so serving each other cafes and making each other popcorn in a movie theater. Of course, the princes don't do that, but otherwise, people who would thought they were impervious to these kinds of economic pressures are now finding themselves poor. And you're seeing more and more of this throughout the region. And this is causing shifts politically. And I think that Biden's team or the people around the embassy have been talking about this for a while already. Again, Saudi's infrastructure has been badly hit by this war. They tried to generate revenues by selling portions of Aramco, which is now a so-called Saudi-owned company. They tried an IPO, issue an IPO. They heralded it and got Wall Street Journal to celebrate it as the biggest IPO in world history. And it was a complete failure. Ultimately, they imposed it on Saudis themselves. They took and forced Saudis to take their pension funds and buy shares of Aramco at inflated prices, which gave them some revenue in their books. But they sold off some pipeline companies for very cheap, hundreds of millions of dollars, which is quite remarkable considering how much it costs to actually build and sustain. So I'm sure there's a lot of that. The idea that the Americans coming on this meeting actually think that Saudi Arabia is such an important player in the global economy or in regional politics, I doubt that they are so naive, that they would be so stupid. I see a lot of them running around here in Beirut. They work for NGOs and all that stuff, and they're pretty dumb. But I assure you that the people who are really who provide the paperwork and provide the kind of bullet points to be discussed know what's going on. And so this meeting that is being celebrated as a confrontation of some sort is really a misdirection. I think there are a lot of other things afoot, which could be about internal politics in Saudi Arabia. It could be about regional politics. The people who are accompanying Biden are coming with a set of decrees, basically. This is not a regime that can just easily brush aside the direction that the larger world is going. There is no defiance. And the idea that Saudi Arabia is making an alliance with Russia is cover for other things. It's a nice story to tell. It makes sense in that Cold War frame that we still apparently operate under, where we have the boogeyman Russia versus the good guy democratic West. But in reality, there are other things going on in that region that have to be addressed by certain factions inside empire who are coming to Saudi Arabia not with on their knees begging, please don't defect. Mohammed bin Salman. That's a joke. As Trump said, you're out of power in 2 weeks without us. So that still applies. None of these regimes can go rogue like they had in Syria, the movie with George Clooney. Right? I don't know if you ever saw that movie. There are no rebellious princes out there who's going to liberate the Arab world's oil from the grab of empire.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these moving pieces right now. The obvious EU need for energy and so-called embargo on Russian energy. This Middle East Eye article talks about, that like you said, the Saudi MBS is being rebellious, that he's now got leverage because he can just say, no, I'm not going to produce more oil and gas for you, and he's being told to, and he didn't, although he did budge on that. But then they also talk about this, how he wants to be king and he needs the blessing of Biden, and he's trying to rehabilitate his image. I mean, come on, we've been through all that. That's not happening. And although I do know that their personalities are, it's not intuitive to me, the things that these people will do and the things they want. But they're not talking about, and of course the recognition of, the alliance with Israel and so on. So I'm sure those are all important issues, but at this point in time, there are so many other things going on, like the increased relationship with Russia and China, like the erosion of the petrodollar, like selling oil to China in their own currency, the currency issues. So I was just wondering why this kind of analysis was done, and I was wondering why it was, I don't know, like the same kind of analysis that's been going on for the past several decades, as if the relationships weren't shifting and changing. But your answer on that is interesting. I'll look at that from a different angle now. But I'm running out of time with you, so if we should probably roll into a bonus question.
Yep.
We don't want the power or the internet to go out over there. And if I could call on you for some thoughts and analysis on the situation with the EU, with Ukraine, with NATO, and with Sweden and Finland now, which neutral countries now look pretty gung-ho to go into NATO. Turkey's at the moment holding it up, but I always figured that Erdogan will make the most of his situation, and he'll want some big things, and he'll get them, and he'll cave in. Now, he hasn't so far. But if we could get that EU perspective from you, particularly the Scandinavian, I really don't have any sense of what that's all about. So I'd really appreciate to hear whatever you want to talk about on that. Is great with me. Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. Isa, before we end, is any new ways that people can follow you and support your work? Or are you still mainly on Twitter and academic papers?
I'm still working. I'm writing some things now, interesting new projects that do with the 1920s and 30s. Very little about. I'm working on a second book, a follow-up book to my Destroying Yemen, but it's going to take a while.
Good. Yeah.
These things keep changing, and I can't just release something, and it takes a year for the publishing company to the university press to develop it, and it's become somewhat outdated by things that are rapidly changing. So, but I'm keeping abreast, and I'm trying to feed into this manuscript that will eventually come out at some point. But otherwise, it's just Twitter and whatever interviews I get, and hopefully it'll be more with you.
Yes, please come back soon.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, and all my best to your family, and I hope things improve there better soon. You get more light and air conditioning, which is probably
not going to happen.
Not, I guess.
No.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks, as always, to Isa Blumi. Follow Isa on Twitter at Isa Blumi. Find his work at Google Scholar and his latest book at ucpress.edu. And all the links are in the show notes. This is a fully independent podcast, and this is a tough era for independent media, so it's more important than ever to support us. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways you can get access to the bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave reviews. All of those things help. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Hang in there, and hope everyone is well.